Hello again, everybody, and thank you for following my lessons. We're going to continue with the next term, but before anything, the disclaimer. I'm not a lawyer, and lessons given are not legal advice. I'm just sharing my professional knowledge and experiences earned over 2 decades. The quotes we use from the Incoterms 2020 book are all the intellectual property of ICC, International Chamber of Commerce, whom I thank for their effort and perseverance in updating and revising the terms and also permitting us to use the codes. FAS, free alongside ship, is the third term and the second member of F family. FAS is defined as delivered on the wharf or on a barge next to the ship. As you can see in this picture, in FAS, the seller is responsible for transporting the merchandise until the wharf and place them on the wharf, and then the responsibility and the risk of the merchandise is on the buyer. This is the definition of the term in the book. The FAS, free alongside ship, requires the seller to deliver the goods unloaded on the wharf or on a barge. It is a very old term and may be used for heavy machinery. To get more information about barge, you can Google this name and then you will see what a barge is. A1. General obligations. In each of the 11 rules, the seller must provide the goods and their commercial invoices as required by the contract of sale and any other evidence of conformity, such as an analysis certificate or weighbridge document, etc., that might be relevant and specified in the contract. Each of the rules also provides that any document can be in paper or electronic form as agreed in the contract, or if the contract makes no mention of this, then as is customary. The rules do not define what electronic form is. It can be anything from a PDF file to blockchain or some format yet to be developed in the future. So, as you have seen in previous lessons, this is a general obligation. We have explained this before, so we go to the next slide. B1. General obligations. In each of the rules, the buyer must pay the price for the goods as stated in the contract of sale. The rules do not refer to when the payment is to be made: before shipment, immediately after shipment, 30 days after shipment, half now, half later, or whatever, or how it is to be paid: prepayment against an email of copy documents, on presentation of documents to a bank under a letter of credit, or other arrangements. These matters should be specified in the contract. A2. Delivery. The seller has to place the goods alongside the vessel nominated or provided by the buyer on the agreed date or within the agreed period as notified by the buyer, or if there is no such time notified, then at the end of that period. The way in which the goods are delivered will be dependent on the nature of the goods and the custom of the port. For example, the goods may be, say, rolls of aluminium sheet, in which case they will likely have an outer sheath and strapping. They could be granite slabs strapped to pallets. They could be timber logs. They could be a large item of complex machinery or some other product. They could be sitting on the quay, or they could be barged down river to the vessel. But the critical point is that the vessel must be present to be alongside of. Placing the goods on the quay, for example, before the vessel berths is not delivery under FAS. Yes, I would like to add that if the vessel nominated by the buyer fails to berth on the agreed date or within that period or at the end of that period, then any emerged costs such as demurrage and THC will be on the buyer. And exactly the opposite, if the seller fails to deliver on the agreed date, period, or at the end of that period, which was agreed in the contract of sale, then because of the delay, the seller will be penalized for that delay, which is a kind of demurrage. B2 delivery. The buyer obligation is to take delivery when the goods have been delivered as described in A2. A3. Transfer of risk. In all the rules, the seller bears all risks of loss or damage to the goods until they have been delivered in accordance with A2 described above. The exception is loss or damage in circumstances described in B3 below, which varies dependent on the buyer's role in B2. B3. Transfer of risk. The buyer bears all risks of loss or damage to the goods once the seller has delivered them as described in A2. If the buyer fails to inform the seller of where and when the vessel will be presented, or if the vessel fails to arrive on time, or it fails to take the goods so that the seller cannot deliver, then the buyer bears the risk of loss or damage to the goods from the agreed date or at the end of the agreed period. This is the same as demurrage and THC costs, which we described in A2 and B2. So the buyer is advised to use the insurance to cover such risks. A4. Carriage. The seller has no obligation to contract for carriage. If the buyer requests the seller, it must provide the buyer, at the buyer's risk and cost, any information known by the seller, including transport-related security requirements that the buyer needs to arrange carriage. If agreed, the seller must contract for carriage on the usual terms, which are usually agreed in the contract or determined by previous dealings between the parties at the buyer's risk and cost. The seller must comply with any transport-related security requirements, but only up to delivery. So here you see that in FAS, the carriage is supposed to be done by the buyer. But if the buyer requests the seller to do that, the seller can do this on the buyer's risks and costs. But this doesn't change the transfer of risk. Everything is the same as the normal form of FAS, but only it is the seller who arranges the carriage. So in this case, if the seller arranges the carriage and then during the loading something happens to the merchandise, then the buyer is supposed to ask the seller to sue the contracted shipping company, which will be in terms a bit hard and may lead to some complications and confrontations. So it is advised that the buyer arranges the carriage by itself. If the seller fails to notify the buyer for any kind of authorizations or official works for loading the merchandise, then any loss originating from this failure will be on the seller. B4. Carriage. The buyer must contract for carriage, which includes the loading on board from the port of shipment, except if it is agreed that the seller makes the contract of carriage as described in A4. A5. Insurance. The seller does not have the risk beyond the delivery point, so it has no obligation to the buyer to arrange a contract of insurance. However, if the buyer requests at its risk and cost, the seller must provide the buyer with information in its possession that the buyer needs to arrange its insurance. As an explanation to A5, I would like to mention a possibility. Imagine that the seller has sold a merchandise based on FAS and has delivered the merchandise on time and has received shipping documents to present to its bank for collecting the LC amount. So the seller's advising bank sends the documents to the buyer's advising bank for confirmation and looking for any non-conformity. At this time, the merchandise is on the vessel, maybe on the way to the country of destination. If the buyer wants to walk away from the deal for any reason, such as falling the price of the product in the country of destination or whatever, then the buyer will ask their advisors to find a non-conformity in the document in order to cancel the letter of credit. So if they do so, and if they can manage to cancel the letter of credit, here is the merchandise on a vessel on the way to the country of destination, with all of the costs and risks on the way. So in this case, if the seller has no insurance for this situation, then the possibility of loss is too high. So we really advise the sellers who sell based on FAS and also some other terms to insure the goods from their own warehouse up to the consignee's warehouse in order to tackle such a risk. B5 insurance. Despite having the risk of loss or damage to the goods from the delivery point, the buyer does not have an obligation to the seller to insure the goods. Whether the buyer chooses to insure the goods or bear the risk themselves is entirely their choice. There are 2 points about this. One first, which is a confirmation to the explanation I gave on A5, is that in such a case, if the scenario which I told you happens, then the seller will not be able to sue the buyer because of not having an insurance for the merchandise in that situation. A6, delivery transport document. The seller, at its own cost, must provide the buyer with the usual proof that the goods have been delivered in accordance with A2. What form it takes is likely to be agreed in the contract of sale, having regard to whether the goods are placed on the quay or brought to the vessel side by a barge and the nature of the goods. Unless this proof is a transport document, then the seller must assist the buyer at the buyer's request, risk and expense to obtain a transport document. B6, delivery transport document. The buyer must accept the proof of delivery provided by the seller. About these items, there are some points. First of all, the delivery document, which is usual in international business, is a document called delivery note, which is issued by the buyer's agent, the carrier, or the seller, but in any case signed and stamped by the buyer's agent in order to confirm that they have received the delivery. But the problem which we have mentioned several times is the shipping documents which is needed by the seller to release the amount of the LC from the bank. In this scenario, because the buyer has received the merchandise and actually he has the merchandise, we have the risk towards the seller for the failure to collect the amount of LC from the bank. As we said before in other terms, there must be an agreement between the seller and the buyer in the contract of sale that the buyer advise its carrier to issue a bill of lading, onboard bill of lading to the seller, which in a letter of credit, a full set of onboard bill of lading, which include the originals and non-negotiable copies, will be delivered to seller, and the seller will deliver them to their advising bank, and then the advising bank in the process of the LC will send these documents to the buyer's advising bank. But please keep in mind that as a seller you must be careful for this process, or if you find it easy to be done, you can accept to arrange the carriage on the buyer's risks and cost. In this way, this is you who has contracted the carriage and the shipping company, and then you will be confident that you will receive the shipping documents as needed. About B6, which says the buyer must accept the proof of delivery provided by the seller. It is needed for the buyer to accept the delivery and the delivery documents provided by the seller. But this depends on the result of any kind of examinations or checking or whatever, which is done by international inspection companies. And if the merchandise is in full conformity with the product and the specifications stipulated in the contract of sale, then the buyer will accept the delivery. A7, export-import clearance. This rule, like all the multimodal rules, is suitable for both domestic and international transactions. Where applicable, the seller must at its own risk and expense carry out all export clearance formalities required by the country of export, such as licenses or permits, security clearance for export, pre-shipment inspection, and any other authorizations or approvals. The seller has no obligation to arrange any transit import clearances. However, if the buyer requests at its own risk and cost, the seller must assist in obtaining any documents and or information which relate to formalities required by the country of transit or import, such as permits or licenses, security clearance for transit or import, pre-shipment inspection required by the transit import authorities, and any other official authorizations or approvals. Yes, in FAS like FOB and FCA, the export formalities are on the seller. This has some advantages. First, because the seller carries out the export formalities, there is no risk of misdeclarations of the merchandise to the customs in the country of origin, which will end up in different complications if it happens. Secondly, the seller company has access to all shipping documents. And third, there is no risk of delay in exporting the product because definitely the seller has enough expertise and contacts in the country of origin to handle the customs affairs smoothly. There is an advantage also for the buyer. Since the buyer may have insufficient contact and expertise in the country of origin for the clearance of goods, it's easier for them to stay away from this part of the job and leave it for the seller to do it. B7, export-import clearance. Where applicable, the buyer must assist the seller at the seller's request, risk and cost, in obtaining any documents and or information needed for all export-related formalities required by the country of export. Where applicable, the buyer must carry out and pay for all formalities required by any country of transit and the country of import. These include licenses and permits required for transit, import licenses and permits required for import, import clearance, security clearance for transit and import, pre-shipment inspection, and any other official authorizations and approvals. They are the buyer's responsibility because they occur after delivery by the seller. At first glance, it might seem strange that both seller and buyer have responsibility for pre-shipment inspections. To clarify, the seller is responsible if it is a requirement of the country of export, and the buyer is responsible if it is a requirement of the country of transit or import. Yes, according to all rules, the seller is not responsible for the items that happen after delivery, and it is only responsible for these procedures if they are before the delivery. But if the buyer requests because of insufficient access to the resources and contacts to handle the problems emerging in the transit process, then the seller can assist but will not be responsible for that. A. Checking, packing, and marking. In all rules, the seller must pay the cost of any checking operations which are necessary for delivering the goods, such as checking quality, measuring the goods and or packaging, weighing, counting the goods and or packaging. I need to add something here. Normally, in any kind of business, the quality and related measurings such as quantity, packaging, whatever, is a matter which has to be settled between two parties. Especially in international trading, because the seller is in one country and the buyer is in another country, and it is crucial for the products to be checked and measured before delivery. This becomes a problem. In many cases, sellers who have their own laboratories or they have their own facilities to check the products give a report indicating that the goods are in conformity with the requested or agreed quality and specifications. In many cases, the buyer intends to use a third party, such as inspection companies, to check the products for him. If the buyer requests that, definitely the cost is on the buyer. But in many cases, depending on the position of the seller and the buyer in the trade, the seller may accept to pay for these costs. But anyhow, in a normal situation, the costs are on the buyer. Second paragraph, the seller must also package the goods at its own cost, unless for the trade of the goods that they are sold unpacked, such as in the case of bulk goods. The seller must also take into account the transport of the goods and package them appropriately, unless the parties have agreed in their contract that the goods be packaged and or marked in a specific manner. Again, like previous terms that we mentioned this item, in a normal situation, the merchandise is packaged in standard export packaging, but if the buyer wants the seller to package the goods in a specific manner, then the costs will be on the buyer. B8, checking, packaging, marking. In all rules, there is no obligation from the buyer to the seller as regards packaging and marking. There can in practice, however, be agreed exceptions, such as when the buyer provides the seller with labels, logos, or similar. I should add here that in case the buyer asks the seller to use a cheaper packaging in order to reduce the price or whatever, in case this is agreed in the contract and the responsibility is dropped over the buyer because of weaker packaging, the seller will not be responsible and liable. But in case this is not mentioned in the contract and the seller in any way doesn't drop the responsibility on the buyer because of its own request, then in case anything happens to the products, the seller will be responsible. So if you are a seller and the buyer asks you to use a weaker packaging in order to reduce the price, this should be mentioned in your contract in order to get rid of the responsibility in the packaging. A9, allocation of costs. The seller must pay all costs until the goods have been delivered under A2, meaning alongside the vessel for FAS and loaded on board the vessel for FOB, except any costs the buyer must pay as stated in B9. As we said in FAS, the delivery happens when the merchandise is alongside the ship. So if the merchandise is unloaded on the wharf without the vessel being ready due to any misinformation from the seller side or the buyer side, the costs will be on the seller. In case the buyer fails to finalize the date that the vessel is ready to load the products, the costs of any kind of services on the wharf will be on the buyer. And if the seller fails to deliver the goods on the date or during the time period or at the end of the period determined by the contract of sale, then the costs will be on the seller. Second paragraph. The seller has to pay any costs involved in providing the usual proof that goods have been delivered. So if the contract between the parties states that proof as being a bill of lading, then the document fee is on the seller. The seller pays any cost, export duties and taxes, where applicable, related to export clearance. If the buyer is requested by the seller to provide information or documents to assist the seller in their export formalities, then the seller must pay the buyer for these costs. Suppose that the seller requests the buyer to prepare some documentation needed to export the document. Even the DHL cost for sending the documents from the buyer's country to the seller's country is on the seller. B9. Allocation of costs. The buyer must pay the seller all costs relating to the goods from when they have been delivered, other than those payable by the seller. In many cases, and in majority of cases, any costs relating to the goods after the delivery is obtained through the shipping costs. So if there is any extra costs, unnormal or out of regular cases, then the buyer must pay these costs to the seller. Next paragraph. If the seller has been requested by the buyer to provide assistance in obtaining information or documents needed for the buyer to effect loading on board, carriage, import formalities, insurance, and the transportation document, then the buyer must reimburse the seller's costs. For example, in many countries, certificate of origin is not one of those necessary documents for customs clearance. So in case the buyer needs this document, then the buyer has to pay the seller to provide this document from the Chamber of Commerce. Next paragraph. Where applicable, the buyer pays any duties, taxes, or other costs for transit and or import clearance. Additionally, and provided the seller has advised that the goods have been clearly identified as the goods under the contract, the buyer pays any additional costs incurred if the buyer fails to nominate the vessel, or the vessel fails to take the goods from the seller, or closes the cargo earlier than when the buyer notified the seller. We also mentioned this in previous item. 8.10 Notices. The seller must give the buyer sufficient notice that the goods have been delivered alongside the buyer's vessel, or that the vessel failed to take delivery once they were made available. This could occur, for example, where the vessel departed without loading the goods from the quay or the barge. While this rule does not make the requirement anywhere, it would be logical to include in the seller's notice any specific requirements the buyer's vessel might need to make to take the delivery of the goods and load them onto the vessel. These matters would usually be specified in the sales contract between the two parties. If the vessel refuses to take the delivery and to load the merchandise, then we should look for any insufficiency in the information provided by the buyer, or any failure from the seller side to provide the needed specifications in the packing or whatever is essential in loading the merchandise on the vessel. So, the details needed for loading the vessel, anything related to the timing plan, and anything related to the vessel's regulations and requirements to load the merchandise must be communicated between the buyer and the seller. We need to finalize this in the contract of sale according to the specification of the product and the requirements for loading and transporting the merchandise. So we have to be clear about this item, because these items are very, very critical, and in the critical point of loading may create inconvenience. B10 Notices. The buyer must give sufficient notice to the seller of any transport-related security requirements and the vessel's name and loading point with the port of loading. These would usually be specified in the contract. Okay, let's talk about some points you have to keep in mind about FAS. First of all, I would like to tell you that FAS as a term of delivery is rarely used, especially when the deal is done based on a letter of credit. So the first reason is that in FAS, The seller is not entitled to have an onboard bill of lading, and probably there will be a problem with collecting the needed essential documents to collect the LC amount from the bank. So because of this problem, people mostly prefer other terms in order to tackle this potential problem. They use terms like FCA or CFR or CIF to tackle this problem. The second problem that we can mention is that the delivery in FAS is completed when the merchandise is unloaded on the wharf alongside a ship or on a barge alongside a ship. So just imagine that the seller unloads the goods on the wharf and the buyer fails to arrange the vessel or for any other reason walks away from the deal, and the goods are transported to the wharf by the seller ready to be delivered, and the vessel or the buyer fail or do not want to take the delivery. So in this case, the seller is under loss because he has done the local delivery, he has done the customs clearance and many other procedures to deliver the goods, but the buyer or the vessel for any reason are not there. So as a seller, if you accept FAS, you have to keep in mind that these things are possible and potential to happen. So sellers are advised to receive enough down payment so that they can reimburse these sort of costs from the source of the down payment in case they happen. Also, as you might know, FAS is not suitable for goods which need special handling while being loaded. This is the best known by the seller or the manufacturer. And since the seller or the manufacturer are not involved in the process of loading, so this might not be a good term. For this case, I think other terms like FOB or CAF. For such situation, I think FOB or CFR are better than FAS because the seller will be involved in the loading part and the seller knows the best tools and situation for loading out his own produced goods, so it will be done better.